It is always a pleasure and privilege to introduce our commencement speaker at these ceremonies. Doubly so this morning to introduce my friend, Dr. Brian Toews. Brian and I joined the faculty within a year of one another in the mid-1990s and served during those years on a number of committees together. You can read his biographical information in the program. Brian has served on the faculty since 1993 and in a number of other roles. He is instrumental in starting the honors program, directing the Center for University Studies. Among other things, he's added to the curriculum in areas of interest and expertise. He is a scholar. He is a lover of God's Word and of his Son, Jesus. He is a colleague and friend to many of us who are here today. This is particularly sweet as we think about Brian's sharing with you this morning. Because a year and a half ago, when he announced to us that he was diagnosed with cancer, we were not sure he would be here, but by God's grace, here he is. Amen. Over more than 20 years of working and serving together, Dr. Toews and I have had many discussions that have shaped this institution, the curriculum, the way we teach, the way we envision our work here. His understanding of biblical wisdom and the application of it is an example to all of us. You'll note all of his accomplishments, his degrees and awards. I would also note that he did win Faculty Member of the Year twice, which is one more than I did, which says something about the way in which he is loved by his students. And so I present to you this morning our friend, our colleague, our teacher, and our provost, Dr. Brian Toews.
I want to thank the Board of Trustees and my colleagues in the administration, the faculty and staff for making this commencement ceremony an important marker, a cairn as it were, in the lives of these graduates. I congratulate the graduates on this significant accomplishment in their lives, and I welcome the friends and family to celebrate together with them. It's particularly joyful for me to speak at this commencement because many of the graduates have been my former students. About 4 years ago, I had a social cultural studies class with a few of them, and I want to thank you for that because that was probably one of the best classes I've ever had in 30 years of teaching, and it was a real joy. I also have a few of my philosophy students that I tortured by making them read Kant, Heidegger, and Hegel, and I apologize for that. You probably are the only students in America who have read in an introductory philosophy class those scholars, so maybe that's a badge of honor. In thinking about what I might speak about to you today, I thought that I should confer with someone who has a strong biblical and cosmopolitan perspective. Cosmopolitan in the true sense of the word, one who has a sense of the cosmos, the whole world, and also has a sense of the polis, the city, which is the center of so much activity, so much human activity. Someone who has seen the world, the cosmos, and thought deeply about living in it. Someone who could provide wisdom and insight for the new life you're beginning. And so I found no better candidate than the preacher from the book of Ecclesiastes. The preacher, or as he is known in Hebrew, Kohelet, begins with the fear of the Lord, which is where all biblical wisdom starts. And he takes us on a journey as he observes various events in the world. It's as if the preacher is taking a stroll through the busy polis and making observations about what is taking place in the city and commenting on it. And it is comprehensive in every way. The title, Preacher, suggests that the book of Ecclesiastes is a sermon. And in this case, this sermon is based on the text from Genesis 3:17 through 19. Where the Lord said, "Cursed is the ground because of you. In toil you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you, and you shall eat plants of the field. By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread until you return to the ground, for out of it you were taken. You are dust, and to dust you shall return. This text describes the life of human beings outside the garden. The preacher's take on these verses is summarized by his introductory statement, "Vanity of vanities, all is vanity." The Hebrew word for vanity is hevel, and it is translated a number of different ways in the Bible: vanity, futility, and fleeting. And by the way, this gets better. The preacher has some awesome things to say to you, so it's uphill from here. In its most literal sense, hevel means vapor. And I think one of the most interesting or ironic translations of the Hebrew word hevel is Abel, the proper name Abel that we see in Genesis 4. Thus, the book of Ecclesiastes is a sermon based on Genesis 3:17 through 19, as illustrated by Abel, our poster child for the faithful follower of God outside the garden. So then, what does the preacher have to say to you, graduates of this fall 2016 class? Well, first of all, I would like to say that God wants you to live a life of joy in every possible way, to relish in God's gifts to you. In Ecclesiastes 9:7 through 10, the preacher exhorts us to, as it were, live it up. "Go then, eat your bread in happiness, and drink your wine with a cheerful heart, for God has already approved your works. Let your clothes be white all the time, and let not oil be lacking on your head. Enjoy life with the woman whom you love all the days of your fleeting life, which he has given to you under the sun. For this is your reward in life, and in your toil in which you have labored under the sun. Whatever your hand finds to do, do it with all your might. For there is no activity or planning or knowledge or wisdom in Sheol, where you're going." What the preacher does here is he transforms the curses of Genesis 3 into a blessed life outside the garden. The very same areas of life that God cursed are looked at as gifts of God that he gives us to relish in our life outside the garden. And there's a sacramental-like nature to our lives. Sacramental in that these gifts are outward signs of God's grace. And the preacher deals with 4 areas. The first is eating and drinking. Although the Lord said that humanity would eat in toil, the preacher recommends that we eat and drink in happiness and good cheer. Now, if you've ever wondered what the will of God is for your life, be assured, here we are instructed that the Lord has already approved that we rejoice and enjoy his good gifts, that we treat our lives and the food that we eat and the drink that we drink with joyful feasting in his presence. He wants us to be grateful for these gifts. He wants us to relish in them. And so when you go out to lunch or dinner today or tomorrow with your family and friends to celebrate this event, know for certain that the joy and happiness that you share comes from God himself, and he will be present with you as you enjoy your time together. Next, the preacher deals with clothing. You probably didn't receive a theology of clothing, so this is just a mini theology of clothing, and it's pretty amazing, I think. You remember that the Lord had to clothe Adam and Eve to cover their nakedness after their pitiful attempt with fig leaves. Clothing, on the one hand, is a sign that only the Lord himself can cover our sinfulness. Here the preacher exhorts us to enjoy our clothing, and the oil that he makes reference to is probably their version of perfume and cologne. It is a gift of God that we feel good in our clothes. I know you have a favorite pair of jeans. I know you have a favorite t-shirt that you like to wear, a dress, a jacket, or whatever. Clothes make us feel good. And just like eating and drinking and rejoicing in that, it is a visible sign of God's grace. Be mindful of this when you dress for work, when you go in for that important interview, and you look good and you smell nice. This is not an issue of pride, but one of humility, being grateful and thankful to the Lord for how he clothes us, just like he clothes the fields. It is a source of great joy from our gracious God. Next, the preacher advocates joy in marriage. Adam and Eve left the garden married. Marriage won't be without its challenges, certainly, but the preacher says that in the midst of life's toils, marriage is like an oasis of joy. We know from Jesus that in the resurrection there will be no marriage, so marriage is a gift for this time alone. And it's not only the preacher who advocates for these joyful experiences. The Apostle Paul tells us the same thing in 1 Timothy 4. He explains here that there are false teachers who forbid marriage and advocate abstaining from foods which God has created to be gratefully shared in by those who believe and know the truth. For everything created by God is good, and nothing is to be rejected if it is received with gratitude, for it is sanctified by means of the word of God and prayer. The final area the preacher deals with in these verses is work itself. Work with all your might. Here again, the Apostle Paul provides some commentary. Whatever you do, do your work heartily, as for the Lord rather than for men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the reward of the inheritance. It is the Lord Christ whom you serve. The preacher tells us and teaches that work is a gift from the Lord, even outside the garden, and even though it is filled with toil, there is great grace within it. And the work that the Lord gives is unique to our time before the resurrection. You can be a teacher, a social worker, business person, musician, minister, counselor, etc., but only in this life. This is in part what the preacher means by vanity. It is temporary, short-lived, here and then gone. These vocations will not exist in the world to come. This life is unique. It is short and fleeting, like Abel. Abel is basically in 4 verses in Genesis 4. He's here one moment and gone the next. Be assured, though, of this important fact, that the contribution that you will make in the church, society, and the world, albeit limited and temporary, that contribution will resound into eternity. It will all matter. You've been educated at Cairn to serve Christ in the church, society, and the world. These are the arenas of your work. You've been taught to be biblically minded, well-educated, and professionally competent. It is God's will that you take what you've learned and make good on it in the days to come, that you make a difference in your service to Christ. Your education has prepared you to live in the fear of the Lord and to enjoy his gifts of food, drink, clothing, marriage, and work. He's approved it all. So live it up in his presence. And this is not something like carpe diem that is often thrown around as sort of a philosophy of life. Seize the day. Carpe diem is devoid of the fear of God. It is individualistic and selfish. What we have here is a call to seize the gifts of God Seize them in the fear of the Lord. Seize them in the joy of the Lord and for the glory of the Lord. But nonetheless, seize those gifts that God has given you and that he has already approved that you relish them. The second insight that the preacher provides for you, I think, is dealing with the notion of following your own heart. He says this in Ecclesiastes chapter 11. Rejoice, young man or young person, during your childhood. Let your heart be pleasant during the days of young manhood or womanhood. And follow the impulses of your heart. And follow the desires of your eyes. Yet know that God will bring you to judgment for all these things. So remove grief and anger from your heart, and put away the pain from your body, because childhood and the prime of life are fleeting. Follow the ways of your heart and the desires of your eyes. This may sound really strange and foreign to you, because we are so accustomed to hearing about our sinful bent and that our heart is deceptive and wicked. And I think the preacher takes this into account when he says that God will bring you to judgment for all these things. But what I think he is teaching is something like going to a playground. You know that playgrounds have rules that govern what you can and can't do, like don't throw your brother off the swing, don't push your sister off the merry-go-round. But parents take their kids to a playground so that they can explore and create play. And I think the preacher is advocating something like this, something like living creatively and living wisely. The world that you're entering into, in other words, is God's playground. And he invites you, just like a parent says, go play, go create, have a wonderful time. And as you commence this day, the world is indeed like God's playground for you. So follow your heart's desire, or the Hebrew is the ways of your heart and the desires of your eyes. At Cairn, you've been given the gifts to live creatively and wisely. You've received a biblical education that will help you determine whether the desires of your heart are in line with His Word. You've received an education to develop critical thinking so that you can think through the issues and face them and make wise decisions. The mission of the university is that you become men and women of character so that your decisions are ones of integrity. And so as you enter the playground of life, you will need to draw upon these experiences and this education to live wisely. Don't forget what you've learned, but draw upon it as a vast resource for the rest of your life. Knowing the will of God isn't that difficult, really. From Ecclesiastes 9, we've learned that He's already improved the joys of life. And in this passage, He instructs us to follow the desires of our heart in the fear of the Lord. And by the way, this is not something like YOLO. 4 years ago, when many of you were freshmen just entering college, YOLO became a widely used term. Ben Zimmer from the Boston Globe says this: it shot to fame earlier this year thanks to the rapper Drake, whose song, The Motto, and I'm going to butcher this, so bear with me. You only live once, that's the motto. YOLO, and we bout it every day. Every day, every day. That's about all I can quote from this song. After a video for the song, this is continuing the quote from the Boston Globe. After a video for the song was released in February, the buzzword spread quickly among the high school and college-age set by word of mouth, not just in person, but through the turbocharged vehicle of social media. How quickly? Consider the list of slang compiled every semester by students of Connie Ebel, a professor of English at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. YOLO was entirely absent from the submissions by Ebel's fall 2011 classes. By spring semester, YOLO had become the most frequently mentioned slang term among the students, just edging out totes for totally and cray or cray-cray for crazy, unquote. Dr. Williams, I apologize for saying cray-cray at this solemn assembly. But it was the quote. YOLO is different from what the preacher is advocating. YOLO is can be associated with a kind of reckless abandonment to one's desires for pleasure or fun. The preacher is saying that life is a gift. The world, God's playground, is a gift. Youth is a gift. In the fear of the Lord, go do what you want. It's very much like what St. Augustine said many, many centuries ago in his commentary on 1 John 4. He says this, "Once for all, then, a short precept is given you. Love and do what you will. Whether you hold your peace, through love hold your peace. Whether you cry out, through love cry out. Whether you correct, through love correct. Whether you spare, through love do you spare. Let the root of love be within. Of this root can nothing spring but what is good." Augustine says, love and do what you will. The preacher says, fear the Lord and do what you will. These are essentially two sides of the same coin. So I ask, what do you want to do with your life? What are the dreams that you have for your life? What do you hope to accomplish? The preacher's wisdom is to use your own desires as a guide. And this may seem a little scary, but I, just as a footnote, should mention this. The most often repeated command in the Bible is do not fear. Do not fear. My last observation from the preacher is that God makes everything beautiful in its time. The preacher introduces this stroll through the city, this stroll through the polis in Ecclesiastes 3, and it's a very well-known text. There is an appointed time for everything, and there is a time for every event under heaven, a time to give birth, a time to die, a time to plant, a time to uproot what is planted, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to tear down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to throw stones and a time to gather stones, a time to embrace and a time to shun embracing, a time to search and a time to give up as lost, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear apart and a time to sew together, a time to be silent and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. What profit is there to the worker for that in which he toils? I have seen the task which God has given the sons of men with which to occupy themselves. He has made everything beautiful in its time. The times of life oftentimes seem crooked. And one of the ways that the word hevel is interpreted is by the word absurd. Old Testament scholar Michael Fox says this: the essence of the absurd is a disparity between terms that are supposed to be joined by a link of harmony and cause, but are in fact disjunct. The absurd is an affront to reason in the broad sense of the human faculty that looks for order in the world around us. Recall the absurd times of the Abel story. Why doesn't God warn Abel about the danger that Cain presents? God warns Cain about his fall into sin. The Lord doesn't protect Abel from Cain, but he protects Cain from others. The righteous dies, the wicked lives and fills the whole world. The Abel story at one level just doesn't make sense. There's a kind of disjunct, a kind of absurdity to it. And you can see this notion of absurdity even in the book of Ecclesiastes. He talks about going to a courthouse where there's injustice. He remarks that when two people get together, it seems that there's always competition and rivalry. Or the well-known statement that it's better to go to a house of mourning than a house of feasting. There's a disjunct in the world, and the preacher in his observations of the world sees this, and we should too through all the times of life. And I can see the absurd in my own life. When I was a kid, I stuttered horribly. For the linguists out there, any bilabial, a W, a B, an M. And so the worst thing that could happen in my life growing up was the phone would ring, and I'd have to pick it up. And I couldn't say my mom because those are bilabials, and that was a disaster. I couldn't say where or what, like I don't know where my mom is. That would be a total train wreck. So I had a very bad stuttering problem, and it's an absurdity that I make my living by speaking. One of the most common threads through the preacher's sermon is his insistence on the ignorance of the times of life. In Ecclesiastes 9:1, he says that human beings do not know whether it will be love or hatred. Anything awaits them. On top of this, what awaits you may not make a lot of sense because of these absurdities of life. What you've learned here and experienced here can provide you an anchor through these times of life. One of our objectives at Cairn is this: as an academic institution committed to intellectual development, the idea that all truth is God's truth, and the biblical truth that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of all wisdom, the university purposes to impart to its students a knowledge of God, themselves, and the world in which they live. You have an anchor, the intellectual, spiritual, and professional development that you've received here. Rely on it and return to it. The times of your life will have its share of absurdities, but the preacher says that God will make all these events beautiful in its time. The mosaic of your life, all the individual moments will look beautiful in the end. But because we live in the midst of each moment, even this moment now, we can't see the whole picture. And so we are left ignorant about what a particular moment means and what significance it has. And so the preacher calls us, in our ignorance of the times of life and our ignorance of the absurdities of life, he calls us to fear the Lord and to keep his commandments. Last week, Dr. Williams and I were in Cairo, Egypt, and we had the opportunity to visit Cairo University, American University of Cairo. And on one of the buildings, there was a mosaic, and it was probably about 50 to 75 feet tall. And the mosaic was an individual in silhouette holding the Egyptian flag. And the individual tile pieces of the mosaic were photographs of the 2011 revolution during the so-called Arab Spring. And what I thought was so amazing was that you could see on the individual tiles some of the bad events that took place. People died during that time. People were injured. People were also hopeful and joyful with anticipation of what could take place. And our guide was very proud of this mosaic. He was joyful about it, even though the individual photographs may have been something like the times of life that I just read. It held a deep and emotional meaning for our guide. And I think your life will be like that. The individual moments, the times of life that may or may not seem, that may seem absurd to you, that may be difficult. What God says is somehow, some way, the mosaic of your life will be something beautiful under his wise, sovereign, and good shepherding of your life. As a Cairn graduate, you understand the fear of God. You're on the path of wisdom. You understand God, yourself, and the world to a greater degree than when you started here. We send you forth to enjoy the gifts that God has already approved, to wisely follow your hopes and dreams, and to walk a different path through the times of life. May God bless you and use you as instruments in his service. Thank you.